Today we'll be talking about Chapter 30, Section 2, and it's called U.S. Involvement and Escalation. The United States sent troops to fight in Vietnam, but the war quickly turned into a stalemate. And though militarily the United States won every battle in Vietnam, politically we lost the war. And we'll learn about why as we learn about the fickle nature of U.S. public opinion, but especially in regards to war. American public opinion tends to greatly favor war in its beginning, and then almost always tends to turn against war as it becomes protracted or prolonged. And so we're going to talk about how this became a stalemate throughout this week.
Vietnam is a long, narrow country in Southeast Asia, bordered on the east by the South China Sea. France occupied Vietnam beginning in the 1800s. But in 1954, the Vietnamese won their independence by driving out the French. By an international agreement, the country was divided into two areas, the north ruled by communists and the south ruled by non-communists. America's President Dwight Eisenhower feared that if South Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in Southeast Asia might follow. So the United States supported the government of South Vietnam. Tension and violence soon flared between North and South Vietnam as communists grew frustrated at the failure to establish a unified nation. They established the Vietcong, a group of guerrilla fighters that tried to overthrow the government of South Vietnam and put a communist government in its place. The United States continued to give economic and military help to the South Vietnamese. The summer of 1964 saw a turning point in U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The government received reports that North Vietnamese ships had attacked an American Navy ship in the Gulf of Tonkin. Lyndon Johnson, now the president, was determined to strike back. He ordered immediate airstrikes against North Vietnam. Soon, he sent tens of thousands of American troops to Vietnam, and the numbers rose even higher. By 1968, 500,000 American troops were stationed in Vietnam. They used deadly weapons against the Vietnamese and sprayed herbicides that killed the vegetation where the Vietcong hid. But the enemy also had advantages. American soldiers struggled with jungle warfare and with a war that had no clearly defined battle lines. And they had a hard time distinguishing between the North Vietnamese and Vietcong enemy and the friendly South Vietnamese. The Americans mounted search and destroy missions, hoping to weaken the Vietcong and force North Vietnam to surrender. But in these attacks, many innocent Vietnamese citizens were also killed or wounded. As American involvement in Vietnam grew, anti-war protests took place back in the United States. The nation became deeply divided. On January 31st, 1968, the Vietnamese celebrated Tet, the Lunar New Year. That day, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers launched attacks on every major city in South Vietnam. This came to be called the Tet Offensive. North Vietnamese casualties outnumbered American losses by more than 10 to 1, but this was no victory for the United States. Americans were shocked that the communist forces were capable of such an attack. More and more people began arguing that American troops should be pulled out of Vietnam. President Johnson decided to stop bombing North Vietnam and call for peace talks. But the war continued. In 1969, Richard Nixon took office as president. He knew that a growing number of Americans opposed the war, so he introduced a policy called Vietnamization. Under this plan, American troops would gradually withdraw from Vietnam and leave the fighting to the South Vietnamese. But Nixon also sent soldiers into nearby Cambodia to destroy Vietcong bases there. This action triggered a new storm of protests in the United States. In 1970, some anti-war demonstrations ended in tragedy when National Guard troops opened fire.
The National Guard and other law enforcers are harassed by rock throwing and name calling, and at Kent State in Ohio, 4 students are killed.
Pressured by public opinion, President Nixon announced that he would withdraw all American troops from Cambodia. A ceasefire agreement was finally reached in 1972, and the last American troops withdrew from Vietnam the next year. But the struggle between North and South Vietnam continued. With the Americans gone, the Communists set out to seize control of the country. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese troops entered Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, where the government formally surrendered. After decades of fighting, Vietnam was united under a communist government. The costs of the war were huge for the United States. More than 58,000 Americans died in combat, and some 300,000 were wounded. In addition, the war's $200 billion price tag damaged the U.S. economy for years to come.
So, what you just saw was an excellent review of the war. And you saw that this is a war that the United States lost, though we inflicted 10 times as many casualties as our own. But this was also the first televised war. Now, in the beginning, Johnson was conflicted. He had won the presidency partly on his promise to keep troops out of Vietnam. However, even while he was running, his advisors were pressuring him to get involved in this conflict. His Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, had advised the president on escalation, as well as his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk. So essentially, the Johnson administration was pressuring the president to approve boots on the ground. And I want you to understand that in 1964, when the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was announced, the public was in favor of this conflict. And yet, by the summer of 1969, we'll be hosting Woodstock and peace protests, and nonviolent resistance to the war and the burning of draft cards will become the norm and not the exception. Yet, in the beginning, the public supported this war. And yet, we've seen this in every American conflict throughout our country's history, that in the beginning, the public supports a war. That in theory, we love a good fight. But in reality, there's a stark contrast. As the troop buildup escalated, Commander of Armed Forces in Vietnam, William Westmoreland, General Westmoreland felt that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, called the ARVN for short, was ineffective at stopping the North Vietnamese invasion of South Vietnam. He requested increasing numbers of troops to bolster the South Vietnamese army, and Johnson finally made the decision to escalate the war, and by 1967 there were 500,000 U.S. soldiers in South Vietnam. Now the Vietcong, that is the South Vietnamese insurgency, was now facing the most ingeniously mechanical nation on earth, according to General Sherman from the Civil War. The most powerful military on the planet was landing on the other side of the world to quell a local insurgency in the name of stopping communism. And so the Vietcong resorted to guerrilla tactics. Hit and run, ambush, disguises, moving among civilians. The Vietcong were fighting in their home country, and so they had the defensive advantage. Because the United States now had to serve the role of a foreign aggressor, one of the most difficult military strategies in warfare. The Vietcong were able to dig in using tunnel systems, and so they could withstand airstrikes. They could launch attacks from within South Vietnam because they had the support of the people generally. And on Vietcong territory, they would use booby traps, IEDs, improvised explosive devices. And the United States had to find these insurgency bases. And this became a very difficult task. However, we had the tactical advantage. We had superior weaponry. The Vietcong were being supplied by the Chinese and Soviets, and so they did have modern weaponry. And these supplies were being funneled through North Vietnam along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Yet while they were being supplied indirectly by third parties, we had the most resources. We had control of the skies. Our F-14 fighters were indomitable. Now later in the war, Soviet MiGs were engaged in dogfights with our American fighter pilots. We had more resources than the enemy. We are the wealthiest nation on earth at this time, going up against a third world country. So, Vietnam became a war of attrition. Attrition means destroying the enemy by demoralizing them. And the tactic that Westmoreland decided to implement was known as the body count. By keeping up with enemy kills, comparing them to friendly losses, we would demonstrate our superiority on the battleground. It was believed that we could crush the insurgency through superior force. Yet, the Vietcong remained defiant. They were also being supplied by the Soviet Union as well as China. Also, in regards to morale, the United States saw this as a military struggle. The Vietcong saw this as a battle for their very survival. Because we had to be the foreign aggressor, it was a difficult task to win hearts and minds. The United States wanted to stop the Vietcong from winning the support of the rural population. However, the longer we were in country, the more unpopular we became and the more popular the Vietcong became. The weapons we had to use in this conflict weren't helping us win any popularity contest. For example, dropping bombs on the enemy also wound and kill civilians. Search and destroy missions led to the destruction of many villages. For example, napalm. Napalm is a gasoline-based bomb that, when dropped, sets fire to everything it touches. When the bomb bursts, everything that the napalm touches catches fire. In fact, it's a sticky substance that would stick to the skin. You're going to see some terrible examples of that in just a moment. We were fighting in dense foliage, tropical conditions. As you saw in the clip, it makes it difficult to fight in those conditions, allowing the enemy the advantage of cover. We began to use a herbicide known as Agent Orange. It was very effective at destroying the foliage and removing the cover from the enemy. We could drop this over a jungle, wait a few days, and the jungle would be dropped, exposing the enemy hideouts. Well, that toxic chemical is hazardous. My dad's best friend died from Agent Orange exposure. I'm sure you've known people to have died from this as well. Also, these search and destroy missions. Search and destroy missions, like what you've seen in some of these clips, were the preferred tactic of the U.S. military. Since we were fighting an insurgency, and there was no ethnic difference between the enemy and civilians, we had to go on patrols. Essentially, we had to serve a police function, investigating every single village and looking for the enemy. This means we had to suspect anyone and everyone, and it often led to the destruction of property. It often led to false arrests, and it often caused refugee crises. When there is a war in your home country, you will probably try to flee for safety. You know, perhaps some of your family will join the military in fighting in defense of this country, but you will seek safety for your family. That's called a refugee crisis. That's what's going on in Syria. That's what's going on in other parts of the world. That's what happened in Western Europe when the Nazis took over. And that's what happens in any country where there is a war on their own soil. And so the refugee crisis caused over 3 million people to flee their homes in South Vietnam. And often they were relocated to refugee camps set up by the U.S. military. So, ladies and gentlemen, I can't tell you any more about warfare than what that man just said. It's one thing to see it in the movies. It's another to have to live through that. If you've ever seen anyone seriously injured or killed, then you know what I'm talking about. Now, the type of warfare that we were engaged in, the types of conditions that our troops were forced to fight in, and the lack of progress as the war went on, had a significant effect on the morale of our soldiers. Many soldiers turned to alcoholism or drug use. There were even cases of fraggings where soldiers would kill their superior officers or refuse to go into combat or refuse to follow orders. The South Vietnamese government was seen as very corrupt and unstable. In fact, the unpopularity of the South Vietnamese government was causing massive demonstrations among the South Vietnamese. Generally, most soldiers believed in the justice of halting the spread of communism. And for every story of dishonorable conduct, there are countless stories of courage. And for every story of disloyalty, there are numerous stories of bravery and self-sacrifice. Most soldiers generally felt they were doing their duty. However, this sense of duty had to be coupled with an understanding of realism and what was going on in the country. That our soldiers were fighting to preserve a government that did not seem democratic in the least and was largely unpopular and disliked by its own people. And this war that we had been fighting was showing no clear results, and so many soldiers turned to humor to try to rationalize this insanity. It's also unfortunate that any conflict in which we engage is going to halt domestic spending programs. The war grew more costly as more soldiers landed in country. This contributed to a rise in the inflation rate, an increased level of taxes, and a reduction in domestic spending programs. Essentially, the war on poverty was put on hold for the Vietnam War. But I cannot emphasize the power of seeing these things for yourself. It's one thing for me to tell you about war and how awful it is. It's another to experience death. Seeing it on television now is perhaps not as powerful, but it's still more personal than reading about it in a newspaper or hearing about death on a radio report. Every night, Americans tuned in and watched the nightly news. That's how people stayed up to date. And every night, Americans tuned in and saw soldiers returned in coffins. And this shows a stark picture of the war. While Johnson's administration was reporting victory, 10-to-1 casualty rates, critics began to describe a credibility gap between what the administration was reporting and what they were seeing on the television. Again, this is the very first war that was televised, that people could see, that journalists and correspondents were traveling with U.S. patrols and filming these actions, and they were showing up every day. People began to doubt the possibility of success, began to doubt the chief objectives in this war even.